And this session is going to look at resourcing the state's response to the challenge of biodiversity loss. And we thought this was important to include specifically because it's mentioned in our terms of reference, how the state will resource its response to biodiversity loss. We can't answer that unless we know how the state comes to these decisions. And so we have two presentations for you, how our national budget policy works, and then another one on donut economics, which is a type of a different way, perhaps, of thinking about fiscal responsibilities in the economy. We are delighted to have two excellent presenters for you here today. Our first is Eddie Casey. He's Chief Economist and Head of Secretariat with the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, similar to the Irish Climate Council, except I think people listen far more to the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council than the climate, perhaps. Eddie is here with his little daughter Alison, and he came all the way up from Kerry to be with us today. And I just want to acknowledge that with all of our speakers, they are giving up their weekend to come and address the Assembly to make sure the Assembly is as informed as possible. And we're very grateful to you, Eddie, and your family for that as well. So please join me in giving Eddie Casey a very warm welcome.
Thanks very much. I'm delighted to give my time, first of all, because I think it's a great cause, great assembly, and I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you. So I'm going to talk about how budgetary policy works in Ireland right now. And there's kind of three things I think you need to get your head around, really. As it's a citizens' assembly, do we have any teachers here? Maybe put your hands up if you're... Okay, so there's three kind of ways to look at how budgets work. One is what economic policy teaches us, so the teachers over here. Do we have any guards, judges, lawyers? So, okay, you're going to represent what the rules tell us, okay? And then lastly, do we have any really big personality that's after emerging? Anyone with a massive personality that someone else can
There
point
are
to?
a few. I mean, we all know who they are.
Okay. We all know who they are, so, well, they're going to be the politicians, right? So this is the politics. And those three things combine to get us to what budgetary policy actually looks like. And none of them are reliable, I should add. So, first thing I want to say is, government's budgeting is not like a household budget. You hear this a lot in the UK. Politics wants to push it that direction. It's not the same. A government can borrow at way cheaper interest rates, and it can run deficits, so it can basically borrow continuously for a very long time. And as well as that, a state can always borrow in the future. It can always tax in the future as well. So if it's not earning enough to cover what it's spending, it can always raise taxes in the future. Now, there's limits to that, okay? So eventually people might decide the tax rates are too high, they're going to move away. Firms might decide to relocate where they have their businesses, and you're going to hit a limit to this. But the next thing is, a government has macro impacts in its decisions. It's not like a household deciding, I'm going to spend a little bit more this year, and it's for me. If a government decides to do that, it's going to impact all of us through adding to inflation. If there's already very low unemployment rates in the economy, they'll push up prices by stimulating things further. And if we're in a downturn, the government can really step in with huge firepower and push down unemployment if it's after skyrocketing. So it's very different to how a household budget works. And the kind of key way to think about how government budgets can become unsustainable is about the debt ratio that's built up. So this is the accumulation of all the borrowing that's taken place in previous years. And the government can have a very low debt ratio like we had before the financial crisis. So Ireland would have had a debt ratio of about 25% GDP, national income. And this is a good way to think about this. So I often show this to students and to other people. When we're talking about the debt ratio, there's a lot of uncertainty around how a debt ratio will pan out. And if you look at, I don't have a laser, but you can see the green lines here are basically the uncertainty about how debt will evolve over the next 10 years. If you hit a shock, which is that line there, that shock represents basically what happens to the debt ratio when you hit lower growth or higher interest rates. And you can see it starts to rise, but it's not a terribly worrying picture. It's still in and around 25 percentage points. Now, if you start with a much higher debt ratio, 100% of national income, which is closer to where we are now, the uncertainty widens dramatically. It's about 4 times wider, the potential outcomes, for the exact same settings. running the same budget balance, having the same growth rates, the same interest rates, the uncertainty around what will happen is much greater. And you can see the top line there, which is the most unfavorable outcome, where you have higher interest rates or weaker growth. That outcome is one which is considered an unsustainable debt path. And this is what the markets will respond to. When I say the markets, I mean traders of government borrowings, people that buy bonds, pension funds, insurance funds. They're the ones that will look at this and go, oh no, we mightn't get our money back. We're going to charge a higher interest rate. So, moving on. Technical difficulties. Here we go. Okay. So the interest rate on a government and what it borrows. If you look at the left-hand side here, going from 0 to 20%, this is kind of the interest rates they would have faced. Back in 1995, when before the Eurozone started, governments would have had very different interest rates on the borrowing. Italy would have had to pay a lot more on its debt, Ireland a bit less, Germany very little. Okay? And those dots show you for a given debt ratio how high their debt is. If they're further over to the right, they're borrowing a lot. If they're up at the top right corner, then they have a very high interest rate on those borrowings. Now look what happened after the euro started. After the euro started in 2000, basically all of those countries saw really low interest rates. It was basically accepted at the time that risks associated with government borrowings had really diminished. And we saw this continue for all the period right up until 2012, when the financial crisis had hit, and then suddenly people started looking at governments again and saying, hang on, there are major risks here. So this tells you kind of two things. One is that the market can be really complacent, and when we suddenly see interest rates spike, it happens very quickly. You can see nothing responding for a long time, but it can come very fast. So this is why we kind of worry about sustainability. Now, to the politics of it. Governments have a tendency to spend a lot of time in deficits, running deficits, okay, about 4 in every 5 years if you look at across OECD countries. Ireland is about the same as that, but you get the odd country that does budgeting a little bit better than us, New Zealand, Sweden, and countries that have lots of money like Norway from gas. And they tend to spend a lot less time running deficits. So why is there this bias, and what does it do? Well, first of all, we can see that if you constantly run deficits, and if they're large enough, you'll run up very high debt ratios. So you'll just add and add to debt. And that's what we've seen in the OECD over a long time span. Why do they run deficits? Well, there's 3 reasons cited, usually, by economists. Like, the first is short-termism. You know, they basically have a very short, slightly myopic lens, governments, when they're looking at things. Politicians have maybe a 5-year term. They're not too worried about the long term, about climate change issues might be down the pecking order. And it's more about today's issues. So think housing versus biodiversity. The second problem is a common pool problem. So everyone's pulling from the same exchequer funds, the same big budget kitty. All the taxes that you pay are going into one big fund, and they're all pulling on that. So, you know, being from Kerry, I can think of one politician that definitely thinks about the locality more than elsewhere, and I'm sure you can as well. Time and consistency. This is the other thing. So generally, governments will commit to doing very sensible, sustainable policies today, but when push comes to shove, they might find that actually it's a bit politically difficult to enact. A good example of this might be raising the pension age, which was decided on at a much earlier stage, but then when it came to the year of actually implementing it, they said, no, don't want to do this. And we can see the same. If they run big expansionary policies today, they might say, we'll raise taxes later on to cool the economy, to pull out that stimulus again, but in practice, it's very unlikely you're going to see that. So what do we have next? Well, we have the police, the rules. Or I should say the lawyers and judges as well. And what we have is a set of fiscal rules that try to constrain how much governments do this. But really, it's up to the government to run its own fiscal policy. It's not like interest rates that we let central banks do it. It's politicians' choices. And the first set of rules were very simple things. You can't run a deficit bigger than 3%, debt bigger than 60%. And they turned out to be way too simplistic, you know. So there are times when you should run really big deficits when the economy is on its knees and you need to support it. And there's good reasons to do that. So the second wave of rules said, okay, let's think about the cycle. If there's a massive recession, we want to boost spending. we should think about, well, what's the underlying deficit, and worry about that more. It turned out they didn't measure that very well, so they are economists. And then the third wave is something we're moving to now, which is basically a spending rule. We're trying to think, well, what would sustainable growth of spending, which the government actually controls, look like? And that's what we're trying to shift to now. The idea is you'd have some debt target in mind that might be sustainable, and then a sense of growth in revenues over the long term, and we can grow spending in line with that. So in addition to that, we have fiscal councils like ourselves, which are kind of watchdogs that try to advise the public, give a clearer picture of how budgeting works, of the trade-offs involved. So if you run spending high today, you might have to run spending low tomorrow. If you have a pension age that you're not going to increase, it's probably going to mean higher taxes in the future. There are clear trade-offs involved and no free lunch. So I'm going to move on to the budgeting today. The government spending rule that it's introduced only last year is kind of in line with the new wave of fiscal rules that we're moving to. And the basic idea behind this is that Ireland's growth is roughly around 5% when you include inflation at 2%. And we know inflation is much higher today. So they introduced this at the worst imaginable time, right before inflation exploded. But the idea is that if we grow spending in line with this, then we should have sustainable budgets. And it basically means increases of about 4 to 5 billion over the next few years. That's what you would be increasing spending by. Now, a lot of this, and what they don't tell you, is that they love announcing on budget day massive numbers and saying this is how much we're increasing spending by and cutting taxes by. But a lot of it just goes simply to standing still. So covering the fact that you have more school kids, you might have more retirees, and they're paying those pensions. And also, it might just go to cover inflation. So the price of doing anything might have risen. Public sector wages are going to rise to keep them in line with increases in the rest of the economy. So these kind of things will eat up a lot of that. And generally, that's about 2 billion. So you have 4 to 5 billion, 2 billion gone already just on standing still, maintaining today's policies. So the rest then, the next, we'll say 3 billion, up to 3 billion, is divided out then. And that's where the big personalities, the politicians come in, and they say, how do we divvy this up? And where's it going to go to? And there's loads of pressures here. So the big pressures that we have at the moment over the medium term are going to be things like aging costs. We have a huge reliance on corporation tax. We don't know if those receipts are going to be there until tomorrow. The handful of companies are contributing the majority of these taxes. And it's now going to be, this year, the second biggest tax we have. So even passing out VAT as our main tax. And then we have climate change, which we know there are big costs associated with, and Sláintecare, health reforms that the government wants to introduce. So there's lots of things on the government's agenda, lots of things they're trying to cater for, and all big costs. And also housing, which I haven't even mentioned, but that's in the capital plan. And then the government doesn't want to raise taxes, really, to pay for these things. It's politically not desirable. And in the programme for government, they would have set out big red lines through what they're not going to increase taxes on. So things like corporation tax, income tax, USC, they don't want to increase, they want to cut. The only things they've really cited are things like the sugar tax, maybe a bit on the property tax side, but these are all really small taxes, and carbon tax as well. Whereas the rest of the areas, there's no commitments, or either, not even that, no commitment to increase, or definitely no increases. So the kind of key things to remember here are basically that, look, the budget is a complex interaction between different stakeholders and different interests, right? One is the rules, which are kind of weakly enforced, and really there needs to be a bit more buy-in for them to actually bind. Second is the kind of politicians and their competing interests, housing, health, all of the demands that we see day to day. And then finally, the kind of the fiscal rules and what they say and whether or not they bind, or sorry, the competing demands, political behavior, what is actually going to be the result, and the fiscal rules, and the economic policy. So yeah, sorry, the third thing was economics. So it's funny that I forgot the economic policy as being the third thing, when of all people I should remember that one. But definitely economic policy talks about whether or not it's appropriate to stimulate the economy now, whether or not we should hold back maybe to prevent inflation, and that's definitely the environment we're in now. I was told to mention the cost of living crisis. There was a protest yesterday, massively attended, and of course it's the hot topic. I chose to leave it out because I kind of see this as noise in the background, and it's going to be hopefully a short-term thing. Most economists think it'll be a year or two. But this is another example of the kind of pressures that the government faces. It's always kind of being pushed towards firefighting. What is the big issue today? And I think this is kind of relevant for you guys. The discussion about biodiversity loss, is this going to be an issue immediately on the finance minister's portfolio when it lands on his desk tomorrow? Or is it ever going to be there? You know, you have to think very carefully about how you elevate these things to the discussion that's happening today. Thanks.